This story starts in a school where we find a girl lost in thought about her brother. Her moment of contemplation is suddenly interrupted when another girl bursts into the classroom, frantically calling for everyone's attention. She excitedly announces that she's just seen the cutest guy in the office. Apparently, he's a new transfer student and a third year. As soon as the girl from before hears this, she realizes it must be her brother. Before we dive deeper into the story, the girl narrates that her brother was thought to have died in a plane crash with their parents. But miraculously, he returned after 10 long years. When she saw her brother for the first time, she could hardly believe her eyes. Their grandpa had the same reaction upon seeing him alive. When her brother looked at her, she was startled. But he just smiled in response and asked if she was his sister Dayan. Suddenly Dayan is yanked out of her flashback by a bunch of girls trying to bully her. These troublemakers demand that she hand over the gym uniform she's brought with her. Dayan tries to reason with them, pointing out that if she gives up her uniform, she won't have anything to wear. Blondezilla just snickers at this and then starts yelling at her. She's so loud that even the other girls in the classroom can't ignore the commotion she's causing for no good reason. Blondezilla finally crosses the line and smacks Dayan on the head, making it clear that she better hand over the uniform, or else she won't be nice to her anymore. While I wouldn't exactly call slapping someone on the head being nice, I guess no one is about to argue with this over-the-top Blondezilla. Even the other girls in the classroom just look away, not wanting to get involved or stop her from getting all high and mighty. It looks like Dayan has no choice but to face the humiliation and silently comply with the demand. The next scene takes us to third year class 2, where the entire class is being introduced to this new handsome fella, who has just transferred into this school. The teacher mentions that he's been living overseas for a long time and asks everyone to be friendly and help him settle in. All the girls in the class can't help but blush at how hot he is. Even the bullies in the room can't resist sneering, while the other students with average looks feel a pang of jealousy at the new guy's good looks. The teacher directs him to an empty seat at the back of the room, and he makes his way over, ready to get settled in his new spot. As the new guy walks to his seat, we spot a redhead guy named Jae-hyung, and we can tell that he is feeling absolutely annoyed. Let's face it, he's just jealous that this new guy is stealing the spotlight with his looks. The big guy seated behind Jae-hyung gives a subtle signal. Jae-hyung quickly catches on to what his friend is trying to say and decides to take action. He extends his foot out, aiming to trip the new guy as he walks by. But Jae-hyung's plan doesn't go as smoothly as he'd hoped, because this new guy quickly halts, leaving Jae-hyung gritting his teeth in frustration. He had timed his foot extension perfectly, but it still didn't work at all. Meanwhile, the new guy, who goes by the name Jin by the way, just gives Jae-hyung a death glare for his pathetic attempt, though he does not say a word. The scene then flashes back to Jin's past, where we see a blonde guy advising Jin to avoid getting into fights once he returns to Korea. Jin lets out a sigh and responds that he's already aware of this much. The senior perks up to hear this, and curiously asks about how Jin knows. Jin then explains that he wouldn't enter any combat situation without having enough intel about his surroundings. Well, it looks like Jin's response isn't exactly what the senior was expecting to hear, because it sounds way too hardcore. But Jin continues, sharing his wisdom from years of experience. He explains that making a rash decision could cost him his life, and such a mistake would be a rookie move. This makes the senior even more uncomfortable, and our boy goes on to remind his senior that he has survived plenty of battlefields over the past 10 years, because he knows his stuff. Suddenly, Major Kong, the senior, tells Jin to stop and clarifies that he wasn't referring to all this strategic nonsense. But rather, he does not want our boy to engage in fights because he wants to prevent the poor offender from getting beaten up badly. In the present moment, Major's advice lingers in our boy's mind, so he does not say anything to the bully in order to avoid fighting. The teacher then notices Jin standing there idly and asks if everything's okay. Jin simply flashes a pleasant smile, saying he is good, and continues past Jiang, ignoring him. Jiang snickers once again, thinking Jin is just a wimp afraid of getting picked on. Even the guy who tried to trip him earlier smiles, pleased with Jin's reaction. Once Jin reaches his seat, the teacher tells one of the students to help him get ready for the first class. With that, the teacher leaves after wishing Jin a good time studying. The student sitting next to Jin quickly introduces himself as Yangqian Park, and our boy returns the gesture, introducing himself as a Jin Yu. Yangqian then nervously glances over his shoulder to make sure no one's watching, and leans in to whisper to our boy that he saw what Jiang was trying to do. He explains that Jiang Li is a troublemaker, but there's also another bully to watch out for, which is Hyuk Jin Yu, who's just as bad. Jin takes a closer look at both of the troublemakers, while Yangqian further reveals that the next class is math. Jin thanks his new friend for the heads up, and Yangqian is relieved to see that our boy isn't just another bully. He tells our boy to feel free to ask him anything, and he'll do his best to help out. The math teacher arrives and instructs everyone to open their textbooks. He starts solving math problems on the board. Some students are busy taking notes, while others look utterly bored. Jin takes in the scene, noticing that Yang Qian is diligently paying attention, while some students are dozing off or messing around on their smartphones. He also glances out the window and sees a group of students playing in the playground. Jin's mind drifts back to his days as a mercenary. He remembers the heavy rain, feeling utterly exhausted and battered. The chaos of his past life, the constant roar of guns and explosions, seems to have left a permanent mark on his mind, yet, in the present moment, as he closes his eyes, there's no unpleasant noise. Everything feels unexpectedly peaceful and serene. As dawn approaches, students start heading home. Among them is Diane, who spots her brother standing nearby. She's momentarily startled and asks if he's been waiting for her. He replies that yes, he was hoping to walk her home. However, he adds that if she has other plans, she's welcome to go on her own. Diane quickly glances around and insists she has no other plans. But we can tell that she is still really anxious about walking with our boy. Jin then states that if she doesn't have anything pressing, they'll walk home together. Eventually, the girl agrees. Later on the street, the siblings walk side by side, both clearly feeling awkward. Jin tries to break the ice and asks if she's feeling awkward too. Diane is startled to hear this and quickly insists she's not awkward at all, but Jin reassures her that it's okay as he's feeling pretty awkward himself. Thankfully, this remark finally makes our girl relaxed a bit. Jin then reveals that he was only 9 at the time of the accident. So he doesn't remember much about his remaining family, including his sister. He points out that it must be pretty strange for her too, since she was only 7 and probably doesn't remember much either. Diane stays silent because this is in fact true. Just then, she suddenly hears some familiar voices around the corner, and her feet suddenly come to a halt. When Diane looks at the source of the voice, she spots one of the girls who bullied her in class. She is apparently the friend of that blonde girl who slapped Diane in the school today. The bully girl immediately notices Diane and calls her out. Diane breaks into a sweat, feeling uncertain about how she is going to handle the situation. One of the guys sitting with the bully girl asks who Diane is. The bully girl reveals that Diane is the girl Huijin dislikes, and Huijin is the same blonde girl who slapped her earlier. The bully girl also spots her brother walking along with Diane and starts teasing her, asking if she's out with her boyfriend. She adds some colorful remarks, saying she didn't know bitches could date as well. Our girl quickly gets timid and frantically tries to reassure her that Jin is just her brother. While this comes as a surprise to the bully girl, who didn't know Diane had a brother, after hearing the rude comments, Jin asks Diane if this girl is a friend of hers. Diane timidly agrees, and admits they know each other from their homeroom, but the cocky girl doesn't let up, calling Diane a bitch again and asks since when they became friends. Diane trembles as the bully continues her rant. Jin then gives the girl a cold stare, one that's enough to freeze the hell itself. The guy sitting next to the bully girl doesn't appreciate Jin's sharp glare. He gets annoyed, and warns Jin to watch himself if he doesn't want to get his ass yanked. Jin continues to glare, which only annoys the fatty more. The bully girl starts egging him on and provokes him to pick a fight with Jin. Eventually, the fatty's patience wears thin, and he strides over to our boy, and Jin quickly shoves Diane back and gets face to face with this stupid head. The fatty demands to know if Jin is trying to act tough in front of his sister. Jin notices how defenseless the fatty is, standing so close that all his vital points are wide open for attack. What's even more amusing is that the fatty isn't carrying any weapons, all he has is this giant ass of his. Jin can't help but feel that this guy is being rash and leaving himself wide open. But then, Major Kang's words echo in his mind once again, which reminds him to not pick fights with anyone. Jin lets out a sigh, averts his gaze, and decides to walk away quietly. But Fatty isn't letting Jin off the hook so easily. That he grabs Jin by the collar and raises his hand, ready to deliver a sharp slap to Jin's face. Before he can make contact, Diane rushes to intervene. She quickly bows down her head and explains to the bully that Jin has been living overseas for most of his life and isn't used to the way things work in Korea. On the other hand, the bully girl snickers to see her begging, while Diane continues to tremble with fear. The fatty, however, snaps at Diane, saying he doesn't care if Jin was living overseas or not. Seeing his sister so terrified and shaking in fear boils Jin's blood. Fueled by anger, he grabs Fatty's wrist and yanks it. Fatty squirms in pain even though Jin hasn't done anything particularly aggressive. Jin throws his bag down and takes off his school coat. Calmly, he tells his sister to wait for him and covers her face with the coat, assuring her it won't take more than a minute. Just then, the rowdy thug charges at him from behind. Jin effortlessly twirls around and delivers a solid slap to the thug's face. The single slap sends the thug staggering, blood spilling from his mouth as he stumbles backward and crashes to the ground like a sack of potatoes. The cocky girl and the other goon feel a chill run down their spines, and I can tell they are about to crap their pants. I4 boy continues like this. Meanwhile, Jin lets out a sigh of disappointment, knowing he's broken his promise to Major Kong. But, I guess this is not his fault entirely, as this fatty bastard had this coming. The other goon is so terrified that he has started to reconsider making any move against our boy. The next scene takes us to the countryside, where military soldiers are training tirelessly. Among them is Major Kong, overseeing the rigorous exercises. A fellow soldier approaches from behind and reminds Kong that today is Jin's first day at school. Hearing this, Major Kong gets concerned that despite 6 months of lessons on leading a normal life, Jin might struggle to adapt to his normal school life after so many years as a mercenary. But still, Kong feels a sense of pride, and he's confident that the lessons he imparted to Jin will help him thrive in his new life. While it turns out Major Kang's teachings didn't quite do the trick because Jin is making these bullies look like yesterday's trash. The other bullies watch in shock as the injured fatty lies unconscious. Eyes rolled back. The bully girl and her sidekick are shaking with fear as Jin strides toward them. In a flash, Jin lunges and lands a devastating punch right in the gut of the other thug, sending him flying and crashing to the ground. The cocky girl's jaw drops in disbelief. When Jin turns his attention to her, his death glare makes her tremble with fear. Diane pulls the coat off her face, her hands trembling as she takes in the side of the two thugs down for the count. Even though it's only been a minute since she was covered, Jin notices his sister watching him and, after giving the cocky girl one last intimidating look, he walks away from her. He turns to Diane and apologizes for covering her face so abruptly. The apology only makes Diane feel more awkward, so Jin tries to lighten the mood by suggesting they grab some snacks from her favorite store. Diane stammers that it's okay and they don't need to, so Jin decides they should just head home. As Diane and Jin cozy up, the bully girl is left terrified to see this. She's completely blown away by how this guy who was so terrifying with just a glare is now acting like a sweet, caring brother. As the siblings walk off together, Diane gives her one last friendly wave before they head out, leaving the bully girl standing there, face frozen in terror. As they walk home, Diane asks Jin if he was the one who knocked out those two guys earlier. Jin confirms it, and this only makes her curious about her brother, since he doesn't seem like the type to pick fights. She then explains that in Korea, staring at people like he did can be considered rude and might lead to uncomfortable situations. Jin agrees, adding that meeting someone's gaze can be risky depending on who you're staring at, which is similar to where he's from. Confused, Diane asks why he stared at those thugs earlier. Jin simply replies that he noticed she was scared and he wanted to protect his sister. Diane is startled by these unexpected responses, and she simply bows her head down while blushing. An awkward silence falls between them as they continue walking. It looks like Diane will need to get used to having a caring brother around to look out for her. When they get back to the apartment, we see Grandpa is a bundle of nerves. He frantically tells Jin to just chill and enjoy some fruit, but our boy insists on taking care of the dishes himself. Grandpa's not sure how to handle this, so he eventually lets Jin take over. As Jin washes up the dishes with a steady hand, Grandpa asks if the dinner was okay, admitting he's not exactly a master chef. Jin, keeping it casual, tells Grandpa not to sweat it. He says the food has been great and he's loved every meal. The old man looks visibly relieved to hear that Jin enjoyed the food. You can even see the glimmer of satisfaction on his face. Grandpa then turns to Diane, asking if she liked the food as well. She nods and agrees. Next, Grandpa shifts gears and asks Jin about his first day of school, and he is curious to know if anything interesting happened. Jin hesitates for a moment, looking a bit anxious about answering. Diane also feels a bit uneasy, reflecting on how eventful the day has been. But after a moment of pause, Jin admits that it was a good day. Grandpa's face lights up with genuine pleasure at hearing this, clearly relieved and happy. Once everyone hits the bed for the night, we find our guy still wide awake. His mind flashes back to when his grandpa first saw him, and he can almost feel how grateful his old man was to have him around. Jin's cold heart has slowly started to warm up after living with his grandpa and sister for a while. Then, his thoughts drift to the time he was stuck on that airplane before it crashed. Passengers were in a panic, and the emergency oxygen masks had popped out of the compartments. As everyone scrambled to put on their masks, Jin's parents focused on making sure their son could breathe safely. It was a terrifying day for him. Just as the plane began its downward plunge, Jin jolts awake in the present, leaping out of bed in shock and breathing heavily from this nightmare. His heart is racing, and he finally realizes it was just a dream. He glances at his clock and sees that morning has arrived. As he sits there alone, he hears rattling noises coming from the living room. He stands up and goes out, only to find his sister preparing breakfast for the day. He looks around and asks where Grandpa went. She tells him that Grandpa left for work at dawn. She explains that Grandpa took time off to be home when Jin arrived, but now his paid holidays are over, so he's back to work. She also puts on her uniform, and once she's done, she decides to leave for the day. She tells Jin that breakfast is laid out on the table and reminds him to make sure he eats. With that, she heads out, and Jin glances back at the spread of food left for him. Back at school, we see the same bully girl and the blonde girl, Huijin. It turns out Huijin has discovered that the transfer student from yesterday is Dan's brother. The bully girl anxiously confirms this. Her mind flashes back to their previous encounter with Jin, and she feels devastated remembering how he knocked out 2 of her friends with just 1 punch. Jin tries to ask why the bully girl is so scared, but the bully girl remains frozen in fear, unable to speak. I have grown tired of calling her a bully girl, so let's just give her an appropriate name, and let's call her Chicken Shake from this point onward. Jin continues to press Chicken Shake about what happened. Finally, Chicken Shake swallows her fear and says they should stop picking on Dayan from now on. The glare Jin gave her is still burned into her mind and she can't shake it off. Despite her fear, she tries to reassure herself that everything will be fine because Jin and her brother are basically the top dogs and everyone at school bows down to them. After a while, we see Dayan again. As usual, she gets brutally smacked on the head. When she turns around, she sees Jin and Chicken Shake together, once again there to bully her. Dayan quickly asks what they both want now, to which Jin tells her to come with her for a second. Our girl asks where they are going. The cocky blonde is clearly ticked off and snaps at Dayan, telling her not to get too big for her boots and to follow orders if she doesn't want to get beaten down. She adds that having a brother isn't going to change a thing. A little while later, we find ourselves at the school's recycling station where Dayan is getting absolutely pummeled by the cocky blonde. After a few solid kicks, the blonde tells Dayan to keep her head down. Dayan, trying to catch her breath, asks why she's getting beaten up in the first place. That's when Jin reminds her about her brother. She tells Dayan that her brother doesn't have to act like a tough guy and warns her to explain to her brother to stop getting so full of himself. She further makes it clear that they won't be responsible for Dayan's brother anymore because he's in for one hell of a ride. Dayan, still clueless, asks if that means they're targeting her brother from now on. Jin quickly confirms, reminding her that the 2 bullies our boy took down were friends of her brother. Since Dayan and her brother dared to mess with them, they're not going to get off easy. It's like poking a lion and expecting not to get mauled. Dayan's face goes absolutely pale upon hearing this. She yells at 2 thugs, demanding to know what they're planning to do with her brother. But all she gets in response is a solid slap across the face for speaking out of turn. The slap leaves a bruise in her cheek, but the sting of the physical pain is nothing compared to the ache she feels knowing her brother is in serious trouble. Dayan clenches her jaw, steels herself, and bolts out of the recycling station, leaving the 2 thug women behind. The scene cuts back to 3rd year class 2. The atmosphere is thick with anxiety. Even the 2 average bullies in the class are unusually quiet. Everyone's on edge because the school's biggest bully is strolling into the classroom with his entourage, and it looks like the drama with Jin is about to kick off big time. But Jin just sits there cool as a cucumber. The 2 bullies who got knocked down yesterday are also strolling down with their boss. Behind them, the biggest bully of all, the top dog, looms large. Right in cue, Dayan bursts into the room like a tornado. She's panting heavily, her face is bruised, and her uniform is smeared with dirt. Jin abruptly stands up from his seat, and his eyes widening in shock as he takes in the sight of his sister's battered face and filthy uniform. The bully boss starts up with some banter, teasing how Jin's sister is worried sick about her brother. He points out how his own sister, Jin, all she does is whine and nag at him to do things for her. Jin also strolls into the scene, and reminds her brother that she will only feel sorry when her brother actually gets his ass handed to him by someone. Meanwhile, Jin is left visibly petrified seeing his sister so bruised up. But before we can see his reaction, the scene cuts back a little to the past. When students were just starting to gather in the classroom early in the morning, we see the terrified face of Yang Chan taking hits to the head from 2 rowdy individuals who are using his face for target practice. Hyung is feeling pretty cocky about his direct headshot and brags to his friend about it. Jin then gets ticked off and demands this nearby student to hand over his eraser. Once the timid student offers his eraser, Jin quickly takes it. He swings his hand with all his might and delivers a precise headshot to Yang Chan. He breaks into a happy dance after landing the perfect hit. But Hyung tries to downplay it, saying this was just a lucky shot. The 2 friends go back and forth, trying to outdo each other with their headshot skills. Hyung decides to take another shot, swinging his hand violently and throwing the eraser down at the poor Yang Chan. But surprisingly, Jin steps in, and the eraser hits him in the waist instead. The 2 bullies are annoyed by the sudden interruption, and the eraser falls to the ground. Jin then takes his seat right next to the terrified Yang Chan. The redhead is visibly ticked off. Feeling Jin is finally getting on his nerves. Hyokjin decides to talk some sense into Jin for stepping in, and the redhead quickly agrees. Meanwhile, our boy simply puts his bag on the desk and asks Yang Chan if he's alright. The poor fellow mutters that he is fine. But we can tell by his pale face he is not fine at all. Yang Chan simply leans toward our boy for avoiding any eye contact with those bullies, and asks our boy if they should hang out after school. Jin reveals that he has to walk home with his sister so he can't hang out. The timid boy perks up at this and asks if his sister transferred here with him. Jin shakes his head, saying she was already studying here before he arrived. When Yang Chan asks her name, Jin tells him it's Diane. Yang Chan is startled to hear this, and Jin notices his sudden reaction, so he asks his friend if he knows her. At first, Yang Chan feels reluctant to say anything, but admits that Diane isn't having the best time at school lately. He explains that she was quite popular back in middle school for being smart and pretty, which attracted a lot of attention from the guys. But then a blonde girl named Jin, who was jealous, started bullying her. Jin asks if no one stopped them from bullying Diane. Yang Chan reveals that the girl who used to bully her, Jin, has a brother named Jisoo Kim who's one of the worst troublemakers at their school. What's even worse is that Diane is stuck in the same homeroom as Jin, and she gets bullied to the point where every student is amazed that she still has the courage to come to school. Jin puts two and two together and realizes that Jin started bullying his sister just because someone like Diane, and that's the only reason she's being targeted. But Yang Chan somberly reveals that this is just an excuse, because Jin simply wanted a reason to bully someone. Jin's mind flashes back to several days before, when his grandpa hoped that Jin would have an easier time adjusting to his new school after living overseas for so long. The grandpa then turns to his granddaughter and asks if she's doing well in school too. At that time, little Diane charmingly assures her grandpa that she's doing absolutely fine and never shows a hint of the grievances she faces at school on a daily basis. Her grandpa praises her, noting that Diane is always a brilliant student, and even her teachers speak highly of her. In the present moment, Jin realizes that his sister was just putting on a brave face and hiding her struggles to keep their grandfather from worrying. Then, one of the rowdy bullies kicks the door open, and the entire gang of school bullies saunters into the classroom. Jin quickly asks these rowdy bunch what they're doing in their class. Jisoo Kim, one of the top dogs of the entire school, just says he's there to handle some business. Jin's surprised to see Jisoo and is not sure what to do. You see, Jin is a small fry, while he can deal with the other bullies pretty fine, but he doesn't want to get tangled up with Jisoo Kim. Meanwhile, Jisoo's lackeys inform him about Jin. When Jisoo sees Jin, he starts shouting at his lackeys, furious that they got their butts kicked by a scrawny little punk. He dismisses his lackeys, and provocatively flicks his finger at Jin, telling him to come over. Jin stands up immediately, while the redhead and Hyokjin look totally confused about what Jin did to tick off Jisoo, and they're pretty sure he is pretty much screwed now. Meanwhile, Jin stands his ground defiantly and asks if Jisoo is actually the big shot here. Jisoo sneers, and he finds it fascinating that our boy took his sweet time to figure out who is in charge here. He turns to his lackey and tells him not to just stand there like an idiot and to make a move. But we can clearly tell that the lackey is absolutely scared, but he eventually steps forward towards Jin. But before the showdown starts, Dayan also bursts into the classroom, breathing heavily. In the current time, this is how Jin finds himself looking at his bruised-up sister. Tears well up in Dayan's eyes as she starts apologizing to Jin for putting him into trouble. Meanwhile, Jin scoffs after seeing those tears, and calls her the biggest drama queen ever. Jin, however, tells his sister she has nothing to apologize for. Before she can say another word, he loses it, and slaps this lackey across the face with such force that he hits the ground, knocked out cold. The other bullies who already know how hard Jin can hit start to tremble. With one lackey down, Jin turns to his sister and says that these bullies are the ones who should be apologizing. The fatty charges at Jin with a clenched fist, but Jin effortlessly pushes his hand away. When he spots the exposed throat, Jin delivers a brutal, precise smack to it, like a ninja, leaving the bully spitting and coughing before collapsing to the floor. The other lackey, shaking with fear, tries to land a hit on Jin. Jin responds with a crushing blow to his ribs, and with lightning-fast reflexes sends the lackey tumbling to the ground. Meanwhile, Geis's confidence has finally started to fade away, as he sees our boy effortlessly taking down his bullies like they're nothing. The local lackeys of this class, who are still in their beta stage, stand there wide-eyed and expressionless. Even Jin and Chicken Shake are freaking out, completely losing their composure. After taking down the last two bullies, Jin turns to Gaisu and makes it clear that his sister has been suffering because of these thugs, and he's not about to stand for it. Gaisu finally decides to speak, sneering as he admits that Jin is not a pushover after all. With a smirk, Gaisu swings his leg with lightning speed toward Jin's face. But Jin effortlessly blocks the kick, leaving Gaisu absolutely stunned because he did not expect our boy to react so fast. Nonetheless, Gaisu quickly swings his other leg, which is also blocked by Jin quite easily. Jin seizes Geisu's leg, pulls him closer, and delivers a brutal punch to his face. The punch sends blood spraying everywhere as Gaisu crashes to the ground like a rag doll. His nose and mouth are bleeding, and he looks up in horror at Jin, who towers above him like a goddamn Death Reaper. Without hesitation, Jean swings his leg again, striking the bastard in the face with a powerful kick that sends more blood splattering. The guy, who was once cocky and full of himself, finally hits the ground, defeated and humiliated. The entire class falls silent, eyes wide and shocked as they watch Jean take down one of the biggest bullies in one fell swoop. The two beta bullies are slack-jawed as well, unable to believe that our boy just took down a major player like Gaisu so effortlessly. The girls are equally horrified, with the blonde especially stunned, unable to fathom if Jean is really this formidable. Jean starts walking towards Huijin, who is feeling terrified because she does not want to get slapped and face the same brutal treatment. But before anything else can happen, Diane rushes to stop her brother, pleading with him not to do anything anymore. Jean reminds her that Huijin and her crew have been bullying her for a long time, and he also knows that she was targeted by them yesterday as well. Diane's face falls as she realizes her brother has uncovered the truth, and she bows her head in silence. She then suddenly realizes that Jean is fighting for her sake, so she quickly forces a smile, telling her brother that she's fine and he should stop. Her brother hesitates at first, but eventually agrees, deciding to walk her to class. As they leave, the students in the room erupt into murmurs, unable to believe that Gaisu, the top dog, was taken down by a single boy. Even the beta bullies admit that Jean is hardcore, and they are feeling a wave of relief that they didn't try to take him on earlier. As the chatter continues, the blonde girl trembles in a mix of fear and humiliation, unable to process her defeat. Meanwhile, as Jean and Diane walk together, she expresses her shock at how good her brother is at fighting, but then starts apologizing again. Confused, Jean asks what she's apologizing for. Diane explains that it was her fault he got dragged into this mess. She feels responsible for the fights he had to endure, both yesterday and today. Jean gives Diane a reassuring smile, telling her she doesn't need to apologize for anything, because this is what families are for, to protect each other. He then begins to explain that back where he used to live, everyone only looked out for themselves. They didn't care what happened to others as long as they weren't the ones suffering, but even those people would act differently when their own families were involved. That is when the scene cuts down into the memory lane to a chaotic battlefield, with smoke and explosions tearing through the area. Gunfire and bombardments echo from both sides. In the middle of the madness, we see a younger Jean caught in the mayhem. Among the carnage, he spots one of the opposing soldiers desperately trying to save his little daughter, shielding her from a man who is holding his gun right over their faces. Even in the midst of the violence, the sight of that soldier risking everything for his child left a deep impression on Jean. It made him question what family truly meant and why it was so important. In the current moment, Diane points out that he barely remembers her. So why is he still going out of his way to help? The boy agrees, admitting it's true he doesn't remember her, but insists that doesn't change the fact that they're family. The girl just stands there in silence, but just as our boy's words sink inside her mind, she starts to feel a bit embarrassed. She quickly tells him she's fine and that he should head back to his class. She points out that they're already at her homeroom, so she waves a final goodbye and vanishes, leaving the boy with a faint smile on his face. Back in his room, Jean is still the hot topic of conversation, and he's feeling a bit awkward with all the attention he is getting. The beta bullies then flash him a thumbs up, cheerfully asking what kind of lessons he got overseas because he took those noobs down like they were yesterday's leftovers. They keep showering him with praise, but the boy just sinks into his seat, looking a bit overwhelmed. Even his friend Yang Chun chimes in, saying he was actually pretty awesome, which brings a subtle smile to Jin's face. Meanwhile, we shift to the defeated goons, who are feeling pretty anxious after their embarrassing loss. Their boss in particular is still fuming, grumbling that there's something different about our boy because he doesn't fight like your average third-rate thug. His sister tries to cheer him up, reminding him to stop sulking and pointing out that their loss was just a fluke, and Jean just caught them off guard, so she suggests they should try to catch him later. But the bullies stay silent because they've learned the hard way that our boy is a powerhouse not to be messed with. Still, the blondie reminds her that he's just one guy, and they shouldn't let some dude take us down like this. Her brother finally shuts her up, telling her if she's itching for a fight, she can go take on the boy herself if she thinks it's so easy. Of course, Huijin doesn't like the way her brother's talking to her, so she snaps back that he shouldn't take his frustration out on her just because he got his butt handed to him by some random guy. Her brother is absolutely furious, and it's clear Huijin's words hit him hard. He is seething in anger because we all know that she is speaking some uncomfortable truth. Huijin glares at him one last time, her eyes welling up with tears from the frustration of seeing her brother act like this. Quietly, she turns around and slams the door behind her as she leaves. As she stomps down the corridor, Chicken Shake catches up with her from behind. Meanwhile, Blondie is absolutely fuming. It's incredibly frustrating for her that all those bullies couldn't handle just one guy. She slams the door open as she storms into the classroom, and when she sees Diane sitting in the classroom, she asks our girl that she must be feeling pretty lucky to have a brother now. She reminds her how she now can go to school without a care in the world, and can just run to her big brother if she gets into trouble. Diane doesn't say a word in response, which only makes Huijin more annoyed. She thinks Diane is giving her the cold shoulder just because she has her brother around. She grits her teeth in frustration and makes it clear that she won't let Diane do whatever she wants just because she has a brother. As dusk starts to settle, students begin heading home, and among the crowd is our girl, looking pretty dejected. She's lost in thought, recalling the scene where her brother stood up for her and fought those thugs. She remembers him saying they're a family, and wonders if this means she can finally go to school without worrying about getting bullied. Her mind drifts back to her miserable days under Huijin's rule, where she was constantly bossed around and obeyed every command like a faithful dog. Whenever she tried to speak up for herself, she gets slapped down. Suddenly, her brother appears behind her and asks if something's bothering her. She is startled by this sudden call, but our boy reminds her that he called her a few times already. But she did not respond. The sister quickly says sorry, explaining she didn't hear him, and then asks if he was waiting for her again. The boy nods, saying he was because he still doesn't know his way back home. So, they start walking together, talking about how they should grab some groceries on the way, since Grandpa always gets super hungry when he's home late. As they walk side by side, that rowdy bitch stands behind them. She's looking utterly mad and just can't handle seeing the smile on her girl's face. This bitch is biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to make Diane forget how to smile. In the next scene, we see our duo is shopping around the store. The girl seems to be having a tough time choosing what to get, while people around the store are looking at our duo. Girls in the store can't seem to take their eyes off our boy, and Diane can't help but notice how much attention he's drawing from the ladies. She knew he was popular at school, but it seems he stands out even outside of it. Out of curiosity, Diane finally asks her brother if he's ever had a girlfriend back when he was overseas. The sudden question takes him by surprise, and he looks like he's never even heard of the term girlfriend before. Seeing his confusion, Diane clarifies, saying she means a girl he might be dating. He simply replies that he hasn't had any, which prompts his sister to suggest that he should consider having a girlfriend, especially since he's always attracting girls like a magnet wherever he goes. The boy stays silent for a moment before saying that he's always been too busy to have time for a girlfriend. Diane understands where he's coming from, especially since he's been busy adjusting to a new country. That's when the boy turns the question back on her, asking if she's ever had a boyfriend. The question catches her off guard, and she quickly replies that she hasn't had one either. When he asks why not, she just says she's been busy as well. When they finally get home, we see our boy has been gifted a Samsung Galaxy phone by his grandpa. He's a bit disappointed because he wanted an iPhone instead. Grandpa quickly educates his grandson that iPhones have lousy battery life, so it's better to use a Samsung instead, especially since all the kids nowadays have iPhones. It's kind of a funny jab, suggesting that having a Samsung might actually make him stand out. Diane, on the other hand, is pretty excited because she wanted a Galaxy phone for herself, and she can tell it's the latest model. The boy starts playing around with the phone while Grandpa reveals that he's already saved Diane's and his own number in it. Diane is surprised to find out that Grandpa saved the phone numbers himself, since she usually helps with stuff like that. Grandpa quickly clears it up, saying he got some help from the salesperson. He adds with aggron that he's heard how the younger crowd loves to unbox new things themselves, so he hoped our boy wouldn't mind that he opened the box to save their numbers. In response, Jean quickly says he's totally fine with it. Grandpa then apologizes to Diane, saying the store only had one of those phones, so he couldn't get one for her too. Diane reassures him it's no big deal, and they end up having a great dinner, chatting and enjoying their family time. Later that night, the boy is still playing around with his new phone, and he is really digging into the Galaxy experience. He starts to think maybe Samsung phones aren't so bad after all, and could be even better than phones. The scene cuts to Major Kong, who's busy working at his computer when his phone rings. He picks it up and sees it's Jean, who lets his senior know that he's got a new phone, and teases his new number from now on. The senior is a bit surprised by this news, and even the junior standing behind him asks if Major Kong didn't already give Jean a phone. Major Kong confirms that they did. That's when the senior gets tomato red with anger, pointing out that he had given Jean the most expensive iPhone they had, so he is kind of furious that Jean has changed his phone already. The next morning arrives, and Jean comes out of a cozy shower and notices his sister rushing out in her uniform. Before she leaves, Jean asks why she's heading out so early. She tells him she's actually running late and bolts out without wasting any time. She also reminds him that dinner is already set up, so all he has to do is put the dishes in the sink. As she's rushing down the street, she glances at her phone and is relieved to see that she'll make it on time. She had gotten delayed because she wanted to make a delicious soup for Grandpa, and seeing him smile after eating it made it all worth it. She's just happy to do something nice for him. Her moment of happiness ceases abruptly cut short when she gets a solid kick to her ribs and crashes to the ground. Standing over her are three girls, all decked out in hoodies and masks to hide their identities. the one at the front tells Diane to watch where she's running and accuses her of nearly breaking her ankle. It's clear these girls are just looking for trouble and making excuses to pick a fight. They demand that Diane apologize for her so-called blunder. The poor girl quickly nods and says she's really sorry, but the rowdy leader isn't satisfied and slaps